Why wait for NASA's Artemis mission to reach the moon when we could take a shortcut? Indulge your excitement for Artemis as we ponder this cost-effective alternative. Packed with exciting insights, this captivating video is a must-watch for all space enthusiasts. In this groundbreaking video, we dive headfirst into the latest developments affecting NASA Artemis program. With repeated delays for years, space enthusiasts and budget-conscious individuals alike ponder, why aren't we utilizing SpaceX Dragon launched on Falcon Heavy to reach the moon instead of waiting for costly government vehicles? Join us as we disclose the gripping reasons behind this question millions are asking. When the NASA Artemis recently once again delayed for years and cost more than $20 billion, many people asked me why don't we use SpaceX Dragon launched on Falcon Heavy to go to the moon instead of waiting for the more expensive government vehicles. However, to reach orbit, SpaceX makes thousands of upgrades to Starship Super Heavy. According to the latest announcement from senior SpaceX officials, the endeavor to launch Starship for the third time is set to take place in February of 2024. With a series of upgrades for Starship as well as Super Heavy, SpaceX is guaranteed to create results. Like Musk said, we've got a really good shot of reaching orbit with Flight 3. This is a completely reasonable question, but there are many problems in the answers. Let's expose everything about this in today's episode of AB Space.
Hello everyone, welcome back to another episode of my channel.
In March 2019, Vice President Pence challenged NASA to land astronauts on the moon by 2024 by any means necessary. NASA's response to Pence's challenge was to proceed with what it already had in the pipeline: the Orion crewed spacecraft and the massive Shuttle-Derived Space Launch System, SLS Heavy Lift Expendable Booster Rocket. Badly, SLS has been in slow walk development since 2006, with more than $23 billion spent. And now we're living in 2024, but the rocket will not be able to send humans to the moon until at least 2027. More pitifully, SLS cannot deliver Orion to low lunar orbit like Apollo with enough propellant to fly it home. To fix this, NASA wants to build a new space station in high lunar orbit, which it calls the Gateway, to provide Orion with a destination that it can reach. But to travel down to the moon and back up to the high Gateway orbit requires a lander with double the propellant needed from a low orbit. This Rube Goldbergian plan has been contracted for SpaceX Starship HLS. Too cumbersome and expensive, this is such a big disaster that many people are looking for an alternative. In that case, the contract that resulted in the Dragon crewed spacecraft was issued by NASA in 2014. 6 years and $3 billion later, it has flown astronauts into orbit for the first time. So far, what SpaceX has done is show that a well-led entrepreneurial team can achieve results that were previously thought to require the efforts of superpowers. In theory, Crew Dragon has a dry mass of fewer than 10 tons and 50% more internal space than the Apollo capsule that carried 3 astronauts to the moon. SpaceX's Falcon Heavy rocket has the capacity to lift Crew Dragon and a return stage into lunar orbit. There, the vehicle would dock with a lunar lander that would carry the crew to the surface while the Crew Dragon capsule remains in low lunar orbit. After sciencing on the moon, the astronauts would use the lander to return to the Crew Dragon, fire the return stage and come home to Earth. It would be a tight fit for 4 people, traveling for 3 days to the moon and 3 days back. But a gray Dragon probably would be roomy enough. In fact, NASA selected SpaceX in March 2020 for its first Gateway Logistics Services contract to transport cargo to and from the lunar Gateway. According to the contract, SpaceX Dragon XL would launch on a Falcon Heavy to deliver several tons of cargo to Gateway and remove trash. Speaking on a panel at the Spacecom conference on February 22, 2023, NASA's Mark Wise, manager of deep space logistics for the Gateway program, said that NASA has been working with SpaceX on a series of studies to refine the Dragon XL design and examine cargo, configurations and other capabilities that could be enabled by the spacecraft. The 2 primary advantages of this scenario are cost and potentially speed. NASA now spends in excess of a couple of billion per year on development costs for Orion and the Space Launch System. For this amount of money, NASA could procure several Crew Dragon spacecraft and Falcon Heavy rockets to launch them. Well, the cost comparisons are extraordinary. According to an independent assessment by the Planetary Society, NASA has spent a total of $23.7 billion on the development of the Orion spacecraft, which is designed to take up to 4 astronauts into deep space for 21 days. By comparison, through the Commercial Crew Program, NASA invested just $1.7 billion in Crew Dragon, which has now proven itself. Then there are the launch vehicles. NASA is approaching a total investment of $23 billion in the Space Launch System rocket, which likely is still months or longer from its first orbital test flight. Importantly, the rocket is expected to cost at least $4 billion per launch. By contrast, SpaceX paid for the entirety of the Falcon Heavy's development, and it would likely cost NASA between $150 and $200 million for a lunar launch. Using SpaceX's capsule and rocket could also get NASA to the moon soon, because they are now sending astronauts to ISS. In contrast, there are no guarantees that Orion, a stripped-down version of which made a test flight in 2014, and the SLS rocket will pass their upcoming flight tests. So why wait on the more expensive government vehicles when commercial solutions are already at hand? Well, NASA Administrator Bridenstine was dismissive when asked about using Dragons instead of Orion for the Artemis program. I think it's important to note that Crew Dragon was specifically designed for low Earth orbit, and in order to send it to the moon would require a ton of modifications, he said. I'm not saying you couldn't modify it, but if you modified it, it would look a lot like Orion. Another consideration is that Falcon Heavy is not rated for human launches, meaning it does not include various safety factors that would increase its reliability. However, NASA could solve that problem by launching a Dragon separately on a Falcon 9 and a propulsion module on another Falcon 9. They could then dock a procedure NASA perfected during the Gemini program more than a half-century ago and proceed to the moon. Regardless, do you think NASA will agree to this if Dragon can be fixed to send humans to the moon? Definitely no. This is easy to understand. If that happened, what about their rocket and the politics behind it? For many, it sounds like a straightforward argument. Cancel the slow and outdated SLS and direct its $2.6 billion per year into novel public-private partnerships like SpaceX, which promise to revolutionize access to space. Now imagine this argument from the perspective of a congressional representative from Alabama, home of the SLS. First, cancel the SLS and lay off tens of thousands of constituents, then take that money that had previously allowed their voters to have good incomes, mortgages, and a sense of pride from a high-status project and give instead to California and Texas, where SpaceX is located. You may get laughed out of the room. This is the core dilemma for those who want to end the SLS. How do you make a politically viable alternative? The answer must involve building a new coalition that is stronger and more motivated than the one currently invested in the status quo. This tends to be quite difficult and historically requires a major external event to predicate massive political change. The SLS could suffer a catastrophic failure that's what ultimately ended the Space Shuttle program. Or maybe a series of dramatic political realignments will significantly reduce the influence of regions that most benefit from the current program. Or perhaps the incentives themselves could change. NASA has already transformed its approach to new programs through fixed-priced commercial partnerships that better control costs and reward performance. However, none of these provide clear paths for those who wish to stand against the SLS. The reasons why NASA has the SLS remain far more compelling than the reasons not to have it. Meanwhile, on the eve of its first launch, NASA is readying a long-term contract securing upwards of 24 SLS rockets through at least 2036. The political support for the SLS remains steadfast and is likely to continue. For those who find this distressing, consider this. The lawmakers that make up the SLS political coalition are zealously defending the interests of their constituents, and isn't that the entire point of representative democracy? There is and will remain tension in the U.S. political system between local and national interests. Ideally, local interests align with national interests. And until there is an alternative to the political dynamics that represent the foundation of the SLS coalition, perhaps the best path forward is to focus on making the program more efficient, more capable, and more effective in achieving its goals. Furthermore, in the 22 years since it was founded, SpaceX, a rocketry firm set up by Elon Musk, has become the world's premier space superpower. Its inexpensive and reusable Falcon 9 rocket dominates the launch industry. The firm sends more mass into orbit each year than every other company and country on Earth combined. However, it still has bigger ambitions for the world's largest rocket, Starship. In 2023, Starship underwent 2 comprehensive tests, but both launches ended with a spectacular explosion. The dynamic approach is part of the SpaceX ethos. Diverging from the more conservative methods of its older counterparts, SpaceX embraces iterative design, a philosophy centered on frequent attempts and deriving valuable lessons from failures. This willingness to iterate and learn from each experience sets SpaceX apart, contributing to its reputation for innovation and adaptability in the ever-evolving field of space exploration. That's why the 3rd flight schedule for next month will showcase all the new lessons SpaceX has learned from the 2 previous launches. So, what are the latest changes that SpaceX has implemented for the 3rd flight of Starship? Before delving into specific details, we should understand the true cause of the Stage 2 Starship explosion, which many people have been curious about until now. The cause has been disclosed by Elon Musk, the director of SpaceX, in a recent 2024 update. Musk said the failure was linked to venting liquid oxygen propellant near the end of the burn. That venting, he said, was needed only because the vehicle was not carrying any payload. Flight 2 actually almost made it to orbit, he said. If it had a payload, it would have made it to orbit because the reason that it actually didn't quite make it to orbit was we vented the liquid oxygen and the liquid oxygen ultimately led to a fire and an explosion. That venting would have been unnecessary if the ship had a payload, presumably because it would have been consumed by the Raptor engines on the vehicle in order to reach orbit. So, the explosion is quite normal. Having Starship's 2nd stage with the weight to represent a payload was very necessary for test flights into orbit. The company will have to simulate the payload to test the coordination between thrust parameters for liftoff and precise 1st stage separation. A lighter rocket requires less power whenever engines are involved. For test launches, depending on the objectives, it has to match flight specifications to ensure performance at the correct requirements. The explosion is simply a matter of uncontrolled fuel venting, combined with friction with the atmosphere at extremely high ascent speeds. And this is not a significant concern for SpaceX, therefore the director of SpaceX appears quite confident about the next Starship test flight. "I think we've got a really good shot of reaching orbit with Flight 3, he said. The issue causing the Starship explosion has now been clarified, and what SpaceX needs for the upcoming launches is hardware upgrades, even if they are small but still hold significant importance for the long-term journey of Starship. First and foremost is the upgrade to Starship's communication and antennas. The incident during the 2nd launch is likely fresh in our memories. At an altitude exceeding 148 kilometers, the Starship's Stage 2 momentarily lost signal with the ground system. Though the disruption was brief, any lapse in communication during a rocket flight is deemed a safety concern. This underscores the meticulous attention given to even the slightest anomalies in the pursuit of secure and reliable space travel. To address this issue, SpaceX has installed 4 Starlink terminals on the leeward side of the nosecone of Ship 28, replacing the single terminal previously integrated with the payload bay access hatch. This modification is expected to enhance the new ship's connectivity during flight, complementing the existing radio antennas. Next is the modification to the vents located on the top of the nosecone. Nosecone vent diverters or similar components are often designed to manage the flow of gases or fluids around the nosecone or payload fairing of a spacecraft. They may be used to redirect or control the release of pressure, vent gases away from the critical components, and ensure stable aerodynamic conditions during ascent and descent. Instead of 2 open vents where gas and vapor could escape in all directions as seen in Ship 25, now starting with Ship 28, you will notice a set of cowbell diverters attached to the 2 large header tank vents. These diverters are designed to redirect vapors downward, stabilizing the airflow and preventing issues that could lead to explosions. As for the latest upgrades to Super Heavy, in addition to the improvements introduced since the first Starship launch, such as transitioning from a hydraulic thrust vector control system to an electric one, implementing hot staging to a stage separation process, the upcoming launch of Super Heavy Booster 10 brings noteworthy changes. And that's about it for today's episode. Thank you so much for tuning in, and that's all for today's update. If you enjoyed watching and found it useful, please make sure to subscribe to my channel and hit the like button. And if you want to support our channel and if you want to be up to date, you can become an exclusive member, so click on our perks through the link in the description below. Thanks to watching and see you next time.